Yeah, love hate has become a bit for me. And try not to laugh, but I really love Hill at Carolina. So obviously, we know the Carolina Panthers are the worst team in football, and you know what the worst team in football does? They give up the most fantasy points to tight ends, running backs, and quarterbacks. You know
Yikes.
who plays all those positions? Taysom Hill.
Taysom Hill.
With George Kittle and Pat Frymuth on bye, as well as Purdy and Wilson for two QB and Superflex nerds. I think Taysom is a great play this week with his QB and tight end eligibility. He's always going to be a tricky player to trust, but he played almost 50% of his snaps last week, came away unscathed, and Derek Carr is back. Derek Carr is expected to be back week 9. Might as well fire up Derek Carr as well because the Panthers are very, very bad on defense. So I really like Taysom Hill this week. So with the news that Flacco will be starting this week, it's time to fire up Joey Flax, Josh
Joey
Downs, and Michael
Flax.
Pittman. The Vikings defense has allowed Jared Goff and Matthew Stafford to each pass for 4 TDs in back-to-back weeks, and it's starting to feel like Brian Flores' blitzing scheme has been solved. They've been a bend but not break defense, but lately they're getting gashed on big plays and giving up the second most air yards in the league. And you know what the Colts do best? They air it out. And Flacco, even in his low amount of attempts and fewer games, is fifth highest in intended air yards per attempt. So this is huge news for the Colts. I think it's huge news for people who have stuck with Flacco. And I think he's a great start this week.
Fab, what about you? Who do you like this week? Or
Drake,
love, should I say?
Drake London. Love me some Drake London versus Dallas. In the last 2 weeks, not counting the bye, in the last 2 active weeks Dallas have played, the Dallas cornerbacks have surrendered a QB rating of 125 on average, and none of their starting cornerbacks have been rated better than 60 on PFF. Actually, they're rated the third worst overall. Kirk is a surgeon in the pocket as of late, and although Drake fell well short of his average targets last week versus the Bucks, I think there's a bounce back game versus Dallas. Dallas are still missing Micah Parsons, Deron Bland, DeMarcus Lawrence is on IR, obviously. London paced the entire team in targets last week for 6, only one behind Bijan, so I'm not concerned about his usage at all. I think it was just more of a Mooney and a Pitts week. Drake still leads the team by a wide margin in targets, receptions, receiving yards, and TDs. I think he gets back to his wide receiver 1 stats this week, and I like him a lot versus Dallas this week.
No, you love him a lot. Who's the second guy you like this week?
Garrett Wilson versus Houston on Thursday Night
Whoa,
Football.
we got a Jet.
We have to have a Jet every now and then, or else we won't be doing this podcast proud. He's gone over 100 yards receiving in 3 of his last 4. Since the Davante Adams trade, he's actually outpaced them 174 yards to 84. He was averaging 10.9 fantasy points in weeks 1 to 4, and now he's at 20.8 points in weeks 5 to 8. So he's been going off lately, and he's definitely benefited from having Adams on the opposite side of him to take away some of that heavy D coverage. Houston have surrendered the second most passing TDs all year at 16, and I think Wilson takes advantage of that this week. Despite being rated as very good in coverage, Houston are still giving up the 8th most fantasy points to wide receivers. I think Wilson, again, outplays Davante Adams this week, gets in the end zone, and gets you wide receiver 1 numbers.
That's another one where we were a little. My first love of the week is going to be DeAndre Hopkins versus the Buccaneers on Monday Night Football. So he saw 3 targets and caught 2 of them for 29 yards in his debut with KC. He was only in on a handful of packages as he was just got there and didn't know the playbook. Played about 32% of the snaps. So a veteran like him should now be up to date, pretty much 80 to 90%, if not 100% of the playbook. So I expect him to play closer to 70 to 80% of the snaps on Monday night. And Andy Reid also came out and said today that you could expect a lot more DeAndre Hopkins this upcoming week. So with the wide receiver room looking like an infirmary, Hopkins should see many more opportunities, and the Buccaneers are giving up the 5th most fantasy points, to wide receivers. So I would start him with great confidence in Week 9. Second love of the week for me this week is going to be Rod, your boy, Jakobi Meyers at the Bengals. In his first game without Davante Adams, Meyers was on the field for 81% of the snaps and had a great fantasy day. 7 targets, 6 receptions, 52 yards, and a touchdown. He out-targeted and outperformed Brock Bowers, so he's looking like the clear number one option, especially with Gardner Minshew back there. The Bengals are middle of the pack, giving up the 15th most points to wide receivers, but have allowed two wide receivers to hit double-digit fantasy points in 5 straight games. So I see a lot of points being scored in this matchup, and Meyers has a good chance to find the end zone again in Week 9. So definitely on my must-start list this week. Let's get into people we hate for Week 9. Raj, what do you got?
Yeah, I think he's making the third appearance in Love Hate, but I don't like Trevor Lawrence at the Eagles. And don't look now, but the Eagles defense is finally playing to the level that we all expected them to.
Yep.
In the last 3 weeks, the Eagles have allowed the fewest points per game in the league. They've sacked the quarterback 14 times and have only allowed 170 passing yards per game in those 2 games.
90% was Daniel Jones.
The Jaguars offense has lost Christian Kirk for the season, and Brian Thomas may be out for a few weeks. Fred Lawrence is a major regression candidate this week against the Eagles' ascending defense.
What else do you hate this week, Raj?
Yeah, so don't like the matchup between Amari Cooper and the Dolphins. Cooper is a very talented wide receiver, one of my favorite wide receivers to watch when he's on, but often frustrating as a fantasy option. He kicked off his Bills debut with an impressive 16 points, but fell flat against Seattle. Despite logging a 92% snap share, he just had 2 targets and a single catch for 3 yards. This week, he faces a Dolphins defense that allows the second fewest fantasy points to wide receivers per game and is notably more vulnerable to the run than the pass. Given Cooper's inconsistency, is a risky play this week against Miami and should likely be avoided, in my opinion.
Yeah, I don't like the matchup either, to be honest with you.
Just very up and down player. And like I've had Amari Cooper for a few years, and you just never know when he goes off.
Who do you hate this week?
Tua Tagovailoa versus the Bills at the Bills. So great to see Tua back and healthy again. And for all accounts, he did have a decent first game back versus Arizona, threw for 234 yards and a touchdown with 13 rushing yards on the ground. But he faces a Bills D that's giving up the 6 fewest fantasy points to a quarterback, and have only surrendered a multiple TD passing game twice this season. Buffalo D are actually tied for third in the league with 8 interceptions on the year to opposing quarterbacks, and they're allowing opposing quarterbacks to have a passer rating of only 83, which is top 10 lowest in the league. Bills D are good, and the last time Tua played them, which was at home in Miami, he put up 8.3 fantasy points. So now he's going into enemy territory. This is a matchup to avoid. I definitely consider sitting him in a 1 QB and Superflex leagues, but you might not have that luxury in 2 QBs and 2 QB leagues. I still think he finishes outside the top 20 this week, just like he did in week 8.
Yeah. Who else you got as your hate this week, Fab?
Mr. Call of Duty. Kyler Murray versus Chicago. He's coming off. He's coming off 2 very good games, both about averaging 22 fantasy points per game versus 2 very good defense, Miami and the Chargers. So why is he on my hate list? Well, Chicago D does what Miami and the Chargers do, just only better. Chicago are rated a top 10 in every single defensive PFF category. They stifle the opposing quarterback when they run out of the pocket, and have only allowed for 1 QB to pass for multiple touchdowns. Chicago D have surrendered the lowest passer rating to opposing quarterbacks so far this season and have 13 takeaways, which is 7th best on the season.
I'll go into my first loser of the week, or my first hate, should I say. It's going to be Zay Flowers versus the Broncos. So Flowers has had an up and down fantasy season and has not scored since week 2. He saw 12 targets in week 8 while catching 7 for a $1.15. In week 9, he will get a heavy dose of Patrick Surtain on the outside and figures to have a hard time putting up those top 20 numbers in week 9. The Denver D gives up the 4th fewest points to wide receivers, and only 3 players have hit 17 fantasy points versus the Broncos all season: Chris Godwin, Cedric Wilson, and Jalen Coker. What do those names have in common? They are the secondary options on their team. So I think Zay Flowers struggles in week 9. Second player I hate this week is going to be Rachaad White at the Chiefs, Monday Night Football. So after two very solid outings in week 7 and 8, 29 and 15 points respectively, he gets a tough matchup in week 9 versus KC. Most of his points has come as a pass catcher and has been mostly inefficient as a runner. The Chiefs give up the fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs and have held the likes of Henry, Bijan, Dobbins, and Kamara to 13 points or less. He will be touchdown dependent, and rookie Bucky Irving has seen a lot more goal line touches as well. So I definitely don't like Rachaad White's matchup this week.
I think you can go on record for the rest of the season that any running back versus the Chiefs defense you
Yeah.
don't like as a matchup, especially what they just did